What a privilege to get to respond to such rich and interesting papers. It's been a real pleasure, and so I'd like to thank each of our presenters for the work that they did. The only problem with the day, from my perspective, has been that it's taken an almost superhuman effort for me not to ask a question or make any comments up until this point. But now I've endured until the end. Now I get to have my say. One of the things I thought about this response was, contemporary exegesis of Mark 13 is very complex and very contested, and each of our presenters in different ways has drawn upon different exegetical ideas. And so I thought one of the things that might be helpful before I say something about the individual papers is to present a kind of overview of recent exegesis of Mark 13, not to advocate a particular position, but just to give us collectively, if you like, a kind of map against which to locate the contributions that we've heard today from our presenters. So what I've sent round, many of you will have copies of the text with you, in which case you may not need a handout, but if you don't, then there's a handout coming round that just has the text of Mark 13, which will make it easier to follow the remarks I'm about to make. So part one, Mark 13 in contemporary exegesis. Our papers have been concerned with the political implications of Mark 13 when that text is read in a wider theological frame. Quite naturally, our presenters have wanted to focus on the features of the text that they consider to provide a basis for the theologizing in which they engage. Yet, of course, the context in which their theological reflection is undertaken is exegetical discussion of Mark 13, and that exegetical discussion has scarcely reached a consensus. As I just mentioned, the debates about it are complex and contested. I therefore want to identify, in the first stage of my response, the main points of agreement and divergence between recent exegetes in their treatment of the text. The points on which recent treatments of Mark 13 largely agree are limited in scope, but they are significant. Number one, the context of Jesus' discourse in the gospel narrative should be taken seriously. Right back to the publication of a significant study in French by T. Kalani, published in the 1860s, the identification of 13 verses 5 to 37 within the genre of apocalypse has often been used to argue that the material contained here is fundamentally different from other material in Mark's gospel. It is a Jewish or Jewish Christian apocalyptic tract reworked by the evangelist. The subtext of this kind of treatment has often been a concern with the historical Jesus and the wish to regard this material in verses 5 to 37 as non-dominical, as not coming from Jesus, but coming from the early church. And that was both out of a desire to avoid any implication that Jesus made an erroneous prediction of his own early return, and because modern interpreters often regarded the themes of the discourse as somewhat culturally and theologically primitive. In contrast to this kind of approach, recent interpretations recognize that however much Mark 13 might fairly be said to express an apocalyptic framework of thought, it does not belong within the literary genre of apocalypse. There are simply too many features of the genre absent from Mark 13. Further, Mark 13 and its parallels in Matthew and Luke are thoroughly integrated into the narratives within which they are found. In Mark 13, 1-4, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and then at his trial in 1458, he's accused of saying that he's going to destroy the temple. He responds to the high priest's question about his identity with a repetition of the idea of the Son of Man coming with the clouds, 1462. And at his death, the curtain in the Holy of Holies is torn in two, 1538. Only a commentator who is himself or herself asleep could fail to notice the connections between aspects of the content of 13:5 to 37 and the Passion narratives. The disciples are repeatedly instructed in Mark 13 about the significance of wakefulness, but then in Gethsemane in 14:37 to 38, they're unable to stay awake with Jesus for even 1 hour. 13:24 speaks of the sun being darkened, and at Jesus' crucifixion, darkness descends upon the land, 15:33. For all these reasons, Mark 13:5 to 37, recent exegesis insists, is to be read in the context in which the evangelist places it, i.e. the context of the temple and the dialogue between Jesus and the disciples about the temple in 13:1 to 4, and the part all of this plays in Mark's understanding of the nature and purpose of Jesus' death. This does not make Mark 13 only about the cross, but it does make the cross the context within which the main referents of Mark 13 are to be understood. In other words, exegetes do not read Mark 13 as exclusively or principally about the cross, but it is part of it in much contemporary work on the chapter. So I think that's helpful in locating Craig's paper and the argument that he was trying to make for us. Number two, as Rebekah highlighted for us, there is a huge amount in Mark 13 about knowing when is not the time. There is as much emphasis on recognizing when Jesus' words are not about to be fulfilled as there is on recognizing when they are about to come to pass. Verses 5 to 13, although not only 5 to 13, are widely recognized as belonging within this framework. They describe the treatment that disciples can expect and how they are to behave in this period when Jesus' words are not yet to be fulfilled. Number three, the background to the desolating sacrilege in 13:14 is Daniel 9:26 to 27, where the prince who is to come destroys the city and the sanctuary, forcing the end of the temple sacrifices and putting a desolating sacrilege in its place. This Danielic desolating sacrifice is interpreted in 1 Maccabees 1:54 to 56 in relation to the actions taken by Antiochus Epiphanes in the 160s BC to end the temple sacrifices and to burn the books of the law. How far and in what way this context constrains and determines what Mark might mean by the desolating sacrifice is an issue of debate, but that it matters as background is clear to all contemporary interpreters. So on those 3 points, there is much agreement in contemporary exegesis of Mark 13. Pretty much, however, that is where agreement stops. There is a plethora of exegetical disagreement about details of the text that we do not have time to explore. However, these detailed disagreements exist within the framework of a bigger overarching debate. It is the debate as to whether Jesus' discourse was understood by the evangelist to refer to Jesus' second coming or not. Does the discourse speak of the end of human history or not? Is the discourse concerned solely with Jesus' prediction of a process of judgment and catastrophe within human history, in this instance the destruction of the temple by the Roman army at the end of the revolt of the years 66 to 70? Or is it concerned also with the return of Jesus as the coming Son of Man, verse 26? Is what is being described here not only the destruction of the temple, but also the end of human history? As Ephraim reported, in the history of interpretation, verses 1 to 13 have often been taken to refer to the Jewish people and the destruction of the temple by the Romans, with verses 14 to 37 referring to the second coming. However, while within recent exegesis such a double focus remains the most popular position, this classic way of dividing the material is not reproduced in such interpretations today. Precisely because of the clarity with which the background to Mark's use of the phrase desolating sacrilege is seen, recent advocates of a double focus do not regard verse 14 as the point at which the referent of Jesus' words shifts to the second coming. Material within which the principal focus is upon tribulations related to the destruction of the temple extends much further into the discourse, even if Jesus' words begin to have a universal scope that goes beyond the demise of the temple towards a more general end-time tribulation. Nevertheless, despite this shared perspective, advocates of a double focus certainly do disagree about where the primary shift takes place from discussion of destruction of the temple to the second coming. Some see it at verse 19, with its mention of suffering unsurpassed from the time of creation. Others see it at verse 24, with its chronological reference to quotes, "in those days," after that suffering. R.T. France even sees it as occurring as late as 1332, with only the discourse's concluding material, which is concerned with not knowing the day and the hour, reflecting discussion of the second coming. In his view, everything before that is about the destruction of the temple. Advocates of a double focus also disagree about the specifics of the reference intended by the phrase desolating sacrilege. Is it the Roman destruction itself, or perhaps the earlier failed attempt by the Emperor Caligula to have a statue of himself erected in the temple? Is it the occupying and militarizing of the temple by the Zealots during the revolt of 66 to 70? Or is it perhaps even the death of Jesus, on the basis that for Mark, Jesus' death is associated with the destruction of the temple as the event that precedes both it and the ministry and suffering of the disciples? To summarize then, advocates of a double focus within the discourse of Mark 13 disagree about how in detail Jesus' words should be related to historical events in the first century. They also disagree, sometimes quite radically, about where within the text a shift in focus takes place from the events of the destruction of the temple to the second coming of Jesus. They agree, however, that there is a double focus, and they agree that there is more material in the discourse about the Jewish people, the temple, and its destruction, and less material about the second coming than was traditionally assumed within Christian exegesis. This majority position stands in contrast to a minority view, advocated most prominently by Tom Wright, that there is nothing at all in Mark 13 concerning the second coming. The entire discourse is about the temple and its destruction. When verses 24 to 25 seem so cosmic in scope, speaking of the disruption of the celestial order of sun, moon, and stars, they in fact simply echo the language of Old Testament texts that speak of similar things happening on the day of the Lord, when human empires like that of Babylon will be judged. They do not speak of an end to human history, but of God's judgment and the beginning of a radically new phase within that history. The shocking twist in the text is not any prediction of Christ's return in final eschatological judgment, but rather that within the regular flow of history, Jerusalem and the temple have become so corrupt that they now occupy the place once allotted to the likes of Assyria or Babylon as enemies of God and God's people. The figure of the Son of Man coming in clouds, verse 26, is also on this view not a reference to the second coming. Parallels with 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 to 18, where Paul speaks of what will happen when the Lord descends from heaven at his return, are misleading. Paul clearly meant to speak of Christ's return, but Mark does not. Mark is working exclusively on the basis of the vision of the Son of Man in Daniel 7, 13 to 14, where the Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven, but in doing so does not come to earth, but instead comes into the heavenly throne room before God's presence. Mark's imagery speaks not of the second coming of Christ, but of his coming from earth to heaven, vindicated after his suffering. This vindication on this view is linked to the destruction of the temple, because it is precisely that destruction which shows Jesus to have been a true prophet and his condemnation of Israel's leaders to have been just. In Wright's view, everything in Mark 13 can be sufficiently explained by reference to the events of 66 to 70. The desolating sacrilege is simply the Roman destruction of the city and temple and the replacement of the sacrificial system with the Romans' own abomination. So there's this kind of range of opinion. There are a few things that contemporary exegetes tend to, agree about in the interpretation of Mark 13, but then there is this huge debate as to whether we have a double focus within the discourse on both the destruction of the temple and Christ's second coming, or whether, in the minority view exemplified by Tom Wright's interpretation, the whole discourse refers to the destruction of the temple. So with that kind of map kind of drawn, let me turn to the methods and conclusions of our presenters. I hope that what I've done so far is not entirely irrelevant to the questions I'm about to raise. For as my brief survey has made clear, the variety of available exegetical positions on Mark 13 is more than a little bewildering. Any intelligent theologian could find some exegete who takes an approach to Mark 13 that is congenial to the theopolitical positions that the interpreter wants to advocate on other grounds. I'm not suggesting that any of our presenters today has worked like that. Far from it. I don't think any of our presentations were arbitrary in this way. But precisely because the interpretation of Mark 13 is so contested, I did find myself wishing for more reflection on methodology. My first question for all of our presenters is how they understood themselves to be working with the text as the basis of theological reflection. How do they understand their own processes in reaching conclusions about theology and politics? What is the pathway for them from Mark 13 to what they see as its political implications? When we work under the rubric Scripture and Theology, what actually is it that we're doing? And I wonder, do the theologians among us and the biblical scholars among us answer this kind of question in different ways? Or is that disciplinary distinction itself too simplistic a way of approaching these kind of methodological issues? Another point about methodology that interested me is the way in which a number of our presenters are clearly working intercanonically. And here I was interested and a little surprised, given the density of the possible relationships between Mark 13 and Old Testament texts, that except for the sections of Matthew's paper where Daniel received significant attention, all our presenters work primarily in relation to other New Testament texts. Would it have made any difference to the conclusions reached if the presentations had more extensively explored Daniel or some of the other prophetic texts that seem to be in play in Mark 13? How do we think here about the relationship between the testaments? With those two sets of questions established that apply to all our presenters, let me turn now to each of the individual papers. I was struck by the fact that, sober exegete that she is, Rebekah stuck largely to those aspects of the text where there is in fact a consensus among contemporary exegetes. She's not alone in her trepidation when Googling desolating sacrilege, and I suspect that exegetes who disagree about much else would be content to agree with Rebekah and each other about the significance of the motif of wakefulness in Mark 13. I found little with which to disagree with her in the development of the theme. The only question I have is that she identified resisting empire as a theme of Mark 13, and I wondered within Mark 13 itself, where is that specifically present? Granted, if there is any kind of reference to the second coming in Mark 13, then the claims of ultimate sovereignty implicit in the hope of that event undercut any pretensions that human empires might have to claim a sovereignty that is similarly total and final. Yet whatever might be said about Mark as a whole, there seems to be little material in Mark 13 itself that does not relate more directly to Jesus' critique of the leadership of Israel and what he saw as the corruption of the temple than it does directly to resisting empire. One could argue, of course, that the temple is co-opted into the Roman system and therefore becomes part of imperial structures, but Jesus doesn't seem in Mark to base any of his critique of the temple on this. I appreciated also very much the drawing in at the end of the paper of patristic material from Gregory of Nyssa on the themes of lament and hope as distinctly Christian political perspectives. But I also found myself wondering whether this would not work so much more satisfactorily with the Matthean version of the Discourse, which is directly prefaced in Matthew 23, 37 to 39 by non-Markan material in which Jesus mourns over Jerusalem. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Matthew 23, 37. Moving on to Matthew's paper, I felt that approaching Mark 13 through the interpretation of the phrase Son of Man is potentially a helpful approach. Clearly, verse 26 is a crucial element in the interpretation of the discourse of Mark 13, and Matthew ably assembled evidence from across the New Testament to support and build upon Dale Allison's interpretation of the phrase Son of Man as referring not just to Jesus as an individual, but both to himself in Israel and himself as Israel. The title Son of Man on this view has a corporate dimension. This insight is developed so as to establish the eschatological political agency of the church as it shares in the work of bringing the kingdom, and to establish the nature of this agency as cruciform in the patterns that it takes and the modes by which it is expressed. I found all this immensely helpful, and at one level, the wide range of texts that Matthew draws upon is a definite interpretive advantage. Even if Dale Allison could be demonstrated to be wrong about the meaning of the phrase Son of Man, I think it might well be possible to sustain on other grounds many of the political and theological moves that Matthew wants to make. I also did find myself wanting to know more clearly where Matthew's corporate approach touches ground within Mark 13 itself. In one way, this sounds a strange thing to say because Matthew's conclusions were devoted to doing exactly this for us. But I think what I mean is, where do they touch ground in relation to Mark 13, not so much as a set of implications for the church, but in the first century context, particularly as the argument begins from the position that the Son of Man refers to Christ as himself in Israel and himself as Israel. Well, what are the implications for Israel as well as those for the church? I also noted that Matthew says on the first page of his paper that, quotes, the apocalyptic use of the Son of Man in Mark 13, understood corporately, frames the church's political agency Christologically and eschatologically. The church acts with Christ, and whatever its political action, it has a sharing in Christ's overthrow of the nations. I like that, but again, specifically in relation to Mark 13 itself, I can't find anything in this chapter about the overthrow of the nations. The evangelization of the nations is there, verse 10, and the gathering of the elect from the four winds is there in verse 27, but not perhaps a discussion specifically of the overthrow of the nations. Moving on to Craig's paper, I found the destinations reached similarly helpful. I have no problem in agreeing that one of the political consequences of the cross is the exposure of our perpetual willingness violently to sacrifice others and their interests on the altars of the various idols that in reality we worship. Yet the route by which this conclusion is reached did seem to me problematic in some important respects. Mark's gospel does indeed contain a very strong critique of the corruption of the temple and therefore a consequent sense of impending and inevitable divine judgment that is connected to the rejection and death of Jesus. This much seems to me indisputable, but Craig wants to go further and say that for Mark, this critique implies an anti-sacrificial interpretation of Jesus' death. I think it's quite true that there's not a lot in Mark that explicitly addresses the issue of sacrifice. But observing that it's not explicitly addressed, I think, is not quite the same thing as saying that the interpretation of Jesus' death there is anti-sacrificial. I would just offer the text in the next chapter when, at the Last Supper, Jesus identifies his own blood with the blood of the covenant, recalling Moses' designation of the blood of the sacrificed animals which he sprinkles over the people as, quotes, the blood of the covenant, Exodus 24, verse 8. Seems to me there's a difference between regarding Jesus' death as bringing the sacrificial system to an end and regarding Jesus as hostile to the sacrificial system as it was operated by the temple leadership that he rejected and which rejected him. Seems to me there's a difference between all of that, which is clearly there in Mark, a difference between that and interpreting Mark as anti-sacrificial in principle, such that sacrifice becomes a category within which Jesus' death is not to be thought about for Mark. Craig also wants to argue that for Mark it is Jesus' body that is now the temple, and therefore that the Jerusalem temple is of no continuing interest. I think there are too many details in Mark 13 that seem to demand interpretation in other terms for me to be able to completely accept this claim. Nevertheless, as I noted earlier, the connections between the discourse and the subsequent passion narrative are indeed strong. Craig is entirely right in noting those and wanting to highlight them. I also found very interesting the appeal to John's Gospel, where the identification of Jesus' body as the temple is explicitly made, John 2:21-22. After a long period within Johannine scholarship, where the view that John did not know Mark predominated, there is now strong support for the idea from some quarters that John writes with knowledge of Mark and in deliberate relationship to the contents of Mark. However, in John's Gospel, it's precisely the identification of Jesus' body as the temple that's deeply connected to John's understanding of Christ's death as a paschal sacrifice. If John is drawing the concept of the temple as Jesus' body from Mark, then this again does not seem to me to fit with the idea that Mark's account of Jesus' death is anti-sacrificial. Indeed, it would push in the opposite direction, given the extent to which sacrificial aspects of Jesus' death are highlighted in John as part of his theology of Christ's body as the temple. Finally, there is Ephraim's paper, which is concerned with the history of reception and especially with Luther's preaching upon the parallel discourse in Matthew 24. Here it's highlighted that Luther represents something of a departure in the history of reception. Luther reads the discourse with a double focus. It refers both to the destruction of the temple and to the second coming, but in fact is most interested in neither of these. His focus is instead upon the present and the way in which the catastrophes envisaged in Mark 13 are in fact part of the everyday experience of Luther and the congregations to which he preached in 16th century Germany. This leads Ephraim to identify endurance as an important aspect of Christian political engagement and to take inspiration from the politics of family, learning, and prayer embodied by post-biblical diasporal Judaism. The promise that one who endures will be saved is clearly being understood as a crucial part of the discourse. All of this raises a number of questions for me. The first concerns Luther himself, for whom Ephraim says that history will always look like the events and persons of Mark 13 for all ages until the end. In a formal sense, this is certainly true, but as Heiko Obermann observes, for Luther, quotes, since the preaching of the gospel evokes the reaction of the Antichrist all the more, it also brings closer the final adventus, the second coming, and the last day of the world, end quotes. Is the relationship between the present and future for Luther quite as Ephraim describes them? Luther does apply texts like Mark 13 to today, but living in accordance with these texts also for him hastens the second coming. Secondly, I think I heard Ephraim say something quite significant on the basis of Luther about what he takes to be the proper stance or scope of Christian political theology. He says that, quotes, the developing early modern and modern line of Christian political theology, which aimed at engaging efficacy of decision-making, either positively or correctively, in democratic or revolutionary forms, can at best be but a secondary mode of ecclesial ethics. I find it interesting to juxtapose this with the way in which David Steinmetz summarizes Niebuhr's objections to Luther's doctrine of justification by faith. Quotes, the notion that Christians are simultaneously holy sinners and holy just before God undercuts the quest for that more tolerable justice which human societies can achieve in history, even under the conditions of finitude and selfishness. Is Ephraim's judgment thus a kind of mirror opposite of Niebuhr's concerning the proper scope of political theology? I'd love to hear him reflect more upon this. To conclude, alongside these questions for our presenters, offered in response to the wonderfully rich and varied reflections they've given us on Mark 13 and politics, I want to offer one reflection on the contents of Mark 13. It's prompted by thinking about Luther in relation to another of Obermann's reflections on Luther's attitudes towards politics. Obermann says that for Luther, quotes, the gospel's primary function is not, as assumed today, and as was indeed the case in the City Reformation, to change obvious injustice by introducing social legislation to establish biblical justice, but to unmask hidden injustice, thus saving the souls of duped Christians and opening the eyes of the secular authorities for their mandate to establish civil justice, end quotes. Now, of course, there's a huge debate whether overall this kind of attitude on Luther's part makes for a satisfactory political theology, and it's not one I want to pursue here. But it does seem to me to resonate with an important aspect of Mark 13. Jesus warns against impostors who claim authority by claiming to be who and what they are not and try to lead others astray, verses 5 to 6. This motif reappears in the form of false messiahs and false prophets in verses 21 to 22. The capacity to recognize and unmask those who are falsely claiming authority is therefore of some importance and forms a significant part of what it means to be wakeful in Mark 13. What are the implications of that for Christian political theology? Earlier this week, the British spy novelist John le Carré was interviewed by the BBC. He said, quotes, politicians love chaos. Don't ever think otherwise. It gives them authority and it gives them power. It gives them profile, the idea that they'll fix the chaos for you. I thought that was interesting. It appealed to me, the picture of, politicians as the agents of chaos and spies as the sober realists that kind of keep everything running smoothly. I thought that was kind of amusing, but it also made me reflect. Is it part of the task of Christian political theology, having been equipped through the kind of apocalyptic perspective provided by texts like Mark 13, equipped to know where sovereignty truly and ultimately lies? Is it part of the task of Christian political theology to unmask all such false claims to be able to master the chaos of the world? Thank you.